I'm delighted to introduce to you Professor Luigi Giuliani, who received his PhD in Hispanic Studies from the University of Barcelona in Spain after completing his BA or laurea in Rome, La Sapienza. He has then been living in Spain for the past 2 decades. So it would be interesting to ask him at the end, since he's talking about immigration, what does he consider himself between Italian and Spanish, and his interest in Italian American studies is an interesting hybrid. Since 2000, he has been a professor at the University of Extremadura, Spain, where he teaches courses in textual criticism, literary theory, performance theory, and diasporic and immigration literature, the literature of immigration that we will hear about today, and comparative literature. Professor Giuliani has published numerous essays. We have also critical editions by him and volumes on topics ranging from medieval poetry to Renaissance and Baroque theater and poetics. So he really works on a variety of topics. He also is a drama critic for the Spanish newspaper Hoy, and presently has several book projects underway. The title of his talk tonight is Building the Landscape, Literary Themes in Italian American Narrative. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Professor Giuliani.
Okay, buonasera. This is the only word in Italian I'll say tonight. For the rest, I have to beg your. I have to apologize for my scanty fluency in English, and I'll try my best. But first of all, I want to thank Professor Modena for a kind invitation. And I have to say that I'm proud to be here. And I would like to point out that one of the fields I do my research is comparative literature. In that field, I'm very interested in migrations and literature. And being a migrant myself, that to say, someone who has been living for more than 2 decades abroad and have got a family there back in Spain and 3 children, I consider myself someone who has passed through all the experiences that the so-called immigrants or emigrants pass. So I generally work on the Italian immigrations worldwide. At least that's what I try to do. That to say, immigration towards Germany, towards Argentina, Australia, and other parts of the world. In the last 150 years, 50 years, more than 30 million Italians left Italy. More than 30 million Italians. An estimation, according to an estimation, right now there might be around 80 million descendants all over the world from, citizens of Italian descent. Immigration is not, it is not only something that rooted in the past. Right now, in the last 15 years in Italy, immigration is still ongoing, I think because of the terrible situation of my country. I suppose you have heard about this man, Mr. Berlusconi, who right now is doing his worst to rule the country. Anyway, so in the last 15 years, again, Italians have started emigrating. I'm one of those. So from this background of mine, I'm going to show you how literature can provide some reflections on the idea migrants on the first generation, second and third generation, they can build their own identity. We will sail a bit, we will surf some texts, and I'm very interested in motives, literary motives, and I'm going to show you just one study case. My purpose today is to show the role of landscape as a meaningful setting for Italian-American fiction. Since the topic of the Italian-American tradition and literature might sound new to some of you, I will try to introduce you briefly to the subject. Then I will draw my samples from 2 novels. Pietro Di Donato's Christ in Concrete, John Fante's The Brotherhood of the Grape, written by second-generation Italian Americans who were born and lived in places as different as New York City and Boulder, Colorado. Finally, I will focus my attention on Mario Puzo's The Fortunate Pilgrim, a 1965 novel in which the urban landscape and its artifacts are more than a mere scenery, and in the wake of the so-called city novel genre, constitute themselves as literary themes typical of the Italian-American narrative tradition. Two classes of factors must be taken into account for a deep understanding of how the city landscape is dealt with in early Italian-American fiction. The first class includes factors related to the actual immigrant experience, sociological approaches to issues such as the cultural heritage of southern Italy, the kind of settlement Italian immigrants carried out in the United States, and the building of a peculiar vernacular landscape. The economical, work and social situation of the immigrants and their American-born children. The self-image the Italian community developed along the 20th century. The second class contains literary factors related to both the mainstream and the Italian-American narrative traditions. The existence of the framework determined by the American naturalist and social novel, the peculiarities of the Italian-American writing and its connotation as a vehicle of ethnic science, the presence of intertextual links with the Italian-American discourse, which make its particular literary historiography possible. Though most of the 5.2 million Italians who emigrated to the United States in the years 1880, 1970, came from poor rural areas, especially from southern Italy, they tended to settle in urban areas in the mid-northern cities of the East Coast. For them, emigrating from Italy represented not only a change in country and culture, but also a traumatic and massive innervation, a process that turned those peasants into city dwellers. Though they were not the only European immigrants that underwent such a transformation, Italians particularly showed a scant mobility after their landing in the New World. They tended to stay in urban areas and to build steady communities in inner cities. Despite of their rural past, they did not end up as land laborers, with some exceptions there back, okay? Italians not only avoided farming, but in the range of job opportunities within their reach, they scarcely chose factory work and found themselves naturally employed as construction workers. In the mid-1920s, when the tide of Italian immigration came to an almost complete stop because of the new restrictive American Immigration Acts and the limitations on immigration imposed by the fascist government in Italy, every important American city, especially in the Northeast, had one or more Italian neighborhoods. The so-called Little Italies had a life of their own, made of economic, work, social and cultural relations, where, to a certain extent, the values and the everyday rights of the old country were relived, where Italian and its dialects were ordinarily spoken, where the urban territory was occupied and transformed through the onset of ethnic science. That was the environment that the first Italian-American novelists from the late 1920s and the 1930s portrayed and lived in, the environment in which the cultural myth of the hard-working Italian immigrant was generated. The silent pick-and-shovel Italian workers that had appeared only in passing in Henry James' mainstream prose of the American Sea in 1907 made their voice be heard through Pascal D'Angelo autobiography, Son of Italy 1924, that's a great autobiography, and received literary consecration in Pietro Di Donato's Christ in Concrete, 1939. This exceptional and too soon forgotten novel tells the story of Geremio, a bricklayer who dies in a work accident when the wall he was building crashes and he falls from the scaffolding into a fresh concrete pillar where he drowns. His 12-year-old son Paul takes his place and keeps working to secure his family's sustenance. In the novel, the bricklayer's hard work has a twofold goal. On the one hand, slaving under a padrone is a day-to-day strife for survival, the cause and the effect of emigrating. Jeremio tells to himself, uttering a sort of prayer. Blessing to thee, Jesus, I have fought winds and cold. Hand to hand I have locked dumb stones in place, and the great building rises. I have earned a bit of bread for me and mine. On the other hand, construction work itself becomes meaningful on a metaphorical level. Let's hear again Jeremio talk about his present and future children. I tell you that all my kids must be boys, so that they someday will be big America builders. The personal sacrifice of the workers is reoriented towards a superior goal, the contribution to the building of the new world, a goal that has obvious religious and ideological implications that I can't deal with now. Thus, the bricklayer is a myth generated from the inside of the immigrant community, prepared for internal consumption, a giant cultural hero, a self-image which strengthens the community's self-esteem and ethnic identity, especially against the negative images generated by the outer society. The nowadays rhetorical discourse on Italianità in the United States is still grounded on the powerful image of the builder, the ancestor, the founder, the anonymous and collective hero who comes after Columbus and Vespucci in the popular Italian-American slogan, America, we found it, we named it, we built it. Being a former land laborer, someone who had worked on a horizontal plan, producing food, that is, consumptional goods, the Italian immigrant turned into a builder, someone who worked in a vertical dimension, making potentially everlasting artifacts. The outcome of this transformation left the city spread with buildings. That is to say, Italian bricklayers not only symbolically helped build the nation, but materially contributed to drawing the landscape. This situation is reflected in a remarkable passage of John Fante's novel, The Brotherhood of the Grape. The bricklayer Nick walks the city of San Elmo's sidewalks to show his son the Grand Tour, the complete works of Nick Molise, that's the name of, posing across the street, hands on hips, his face softened reverently as he stared at the building. There she is, kid. Isn't she pretty? You know who built her? You did, Papa. Not bad at all. It's a beauty, Papa. Last 1,000 years at least. Look at that stone, those steps. They flow like water. Great, hell of a thing. Stop, kid. He blocked me with his hand. Down at your feet. What does it look like? Sidewalk. Whose sidewalk? Yours. Wrong. It's the people's. Your father built it for them, to keep their feet dry. Nick Molise believed that every brick he laid, every stone he carved, every sidewalk and fireplace he built, every gravestone he fashioned, belonged to posterity. The town of San Elmo was his Louvre, his work spread out for the world to see. He was angry that the town did not recognize his talents. Had the city council awarded him a medal or a scroll, it might have changed his entire life. What the hell, every year the Chamber of Commerce passed out commendations to noteworthy citizens. So how come they never took notice of what Nick Molise had done for the asshole town? That's the quotation. Di Donato and Fante shared several personal traits. They were roughly the same age. Both their fathers were bricklayers from the Italian mountains of Abruzzo. But the lack of a real Little Italy in Fante's native Colorado and his moving to the West Coast as a young man provided him a biographical experience completely different from Di Donato's. These circumstances and the fact that The Brotherhood of the Grape is a late novel in Fante's career might explain the ironical and light atmosphere of the father and son dialogue. Nevertheless, I think this passage convincingly illustrates not only the lack of recognition of the immigrant efforts in building America, but the strong links existing in the immigrants' view between the city topography and the collective history of immigrants. So when we are concerned with the vernacular landscape in Italian-American fiction, we have to consider the active role played by the immigrants not only in ethnicizing some neighborhoods, by settling in tenements, opening shops, naming places, and so on, but also building part of the city outside Little Italy. The Italian-American identity, both in reality and fiction, appears to be rooted in bricks and concrete. Even today, I belong in stone and concrete, says the protagonist of 1998 Antonio Valerio's novel Conversation with Johnny. Of course, this special and intense relationship between the urban landscape and the fictional characters must be viewed within the frame conventions of the American naturalist novel, a genre which has undergone many analyses and codifications since its appearance at the beginning of the 20th century. Particularly, as for the aim of this paper, it must be said that the opposition between the urban setting and nature has been indicated as one of the features of the so-called city or urban novel. Scholars, in turn, have denied, undervalued, or stressed the importance of the objectively scant references to the natural environment that can be traced in Dreiser, Dos Passos, Farrell, or Wolff. Nevertheless, my point is that, beyond any adherence to general conventions, the practically total absence of natural settings in Christ in Concrete is somehow related also to the cultural position of the Italian immigrant writer. When the social and cultural conditions of the immigrant group change, the same literary conventions are interpreted in a different way and produce different results. Let's consider the urban setting and its natural counterpart in Mario Puzo's The Fortunate Pilgrim. The future author of The Godfather was born in New York in 1920, and in his childhood and teen years experienced the life of the Italian West Side. As Puzo himself admitted, his 1965 novel can be considered a piece of autobiographical fiction. The Fortunate Pilgrim tells the story of Lucia Santa Angeluzzi Corbo, an immigrant woman who arrived in New York in 1908, got married and was widowed twice. She bore and raised 6 children out of the hardships of the 1930s Depression, governing them with an iron hand, applying in her behavior the principles of what sociologists call the amoral familism of southern Italian ethics to get through the poor and violent environment that surrounded her. In spite of her name, Santa, Lucia Santa is no saint at all. Every move, every decision she makes is based on a ruthless calculus, on the instinct for survival, deeply rooted in her cultural heritage and her pre-emigration experience. Contradictory forces seem to rule her feelings about her own life. She despises equally the old country and the new. She doesn't regret her rural past, but at the same time, she's proud of her being Italian and despises the American ways. Similarly, she loves and hates the city environment she lives in. A passage from the beginning of the novel illustrates this point. These country women from the mountain farms of Italy, whose fathers and grandfathers had died in the same rooms in which they were born, these women loved the clashing steel and stone of the great city, the thunder of trains in the railroad yards across the street, the lights above the palisades far across the Hudson. As children, they had lived in solitude, on land so poor that people scattered themselves singly along the mountain slopes to search out a living. Audacity had liberated them. They were pioneers, though they never walked in American plain and never feel the real soil beneath their feet. They moved in a sadder wilderness, where the language was strange, where their children became members of a different race. It was a price that must be paid. In Puzo's novel, the duality city-country, human main artifacts versus nature, is a strong thematic thread evoked from the very first lines, when Larry Angeluzzi, Lucia Santa's oldest son, spurred his jet black horse proudly through a canyon formed by 2 great walls of tenements. Larry works as a dummy boy, the scout who rode slowly in front of the locomotives to warn traffic when they changed station and passed through the city streets. But here, his horseback ride takes place in an eastern city, felt as a western natural landscape. The scene, which develops itself all along the first chapter, has several implications. The main being the association of the boy with the pioneers who built the nation. But it also suggests that the real natural environment for Italian immigrants and their offspring is the city, or even the urban ethnic neighborhood. In the novel, the protagonists' lives are rooted in a very limited territory on the New York West Side. And they don't even get out of Manhattan. The only contact with the plant kingdom is through food. Grapes are brought in every September from the countryside and are distributed and sold in a sort of ritual, and wine is illegally made in basements following the old country habits. The immigrants' behavior is determined collectively by their cultural bias. Even on Sunday, Italians don't go to the beach in the novel. And Lucia Santa distrusts life in the countryside or even in the suburbs of Jersey. She crosses the Hudson only once to bring back home her nearly 1-year-old son Vincent, who had been almost kidnapped by a childless female acquaintance of hers. And she overlooks Vincent's enthusiastic account of his summer camp experience. The country was a place without bricks or pavements. The streets were made of dirt. Apples, small and green, hung on trees all around. Raspberries grew on bushes wherever you went. You just ate everything when you felt like it. The country was a small white house made of wood, and the nights were so cold you had to use blankets. Everybody had a car because there were no subways or trolley cars. The mother was unimpressed. She had lived in the country, but Gino, that's the name of the child, was stunned at the thought of what he had missed. The evolution of a fourth child, Gino's feelings about the environment, is almost remarkable. He begins being absolutely in tune with the vernacular aspects of the neighborhood, but as he grows, he ends up feeling the oppression of the city and, consequently, of his own cultural inheritance. One day, he seeks refuge in the only natural landscape within reach. For the first time in his life, he went into Central Park. He saw a fountain near a horse threw, and took a drink of warm water. He did not even have a penny for a soda. He walked deeper into the park, as far as he could from west to east, until he saw the great white square stones that housed the rich. They meant nothing to him. Gino tried to find a spot in the park where he could sit against the tree and not see a stone against the sky, or darting through the screen of leaves the black shadows of moving carts and wagons. He searched for the illusion of a forest. But no matter where he stood and sat, whenever he made a complete turn, he found at least one facade of stone above the trees, a billboard suspended near the sky, the sound of honking horns, or the clatter of horses' hooves. The smell of gasoline mingled with the scent of grass and trees. Finally, exhausted, Gino lay down by a lake that had concrete banks, and, letting his eyes, made the tall buildings lose their solidity and become airy, suspended above the trees like a picture in a fairy tale. Later, he would come out of the forest and enter the city. Without warning, he fell asleep. There is no possible escape from the city, within the city. No private Walden can be found for an individual whose life is strongly shaped by an ethnic identity that is so entwined with the urban landscape. Gino's disagreement with the Italian-American ways represented by his mother's family codes leads him into an asocial behavior as he unmasks the inhuman and unnatural reality that surrounds him, a concrete society where everyone must pay to stay alive. The only way out is to live for good, and the decline of the old Italian ways helped the immigrants' children and grandchildren to free themselves not only from misery, but from the little Italy that imprisoned their lives. The slow gentrification of the Italian Americans led to the post-World War II flight to the suburbs. And the Fortunate Pilgrim's last page shows the family abandoned Manhattan, crossed the East River, and spied trees on the other bank. A quotation. Then they were ascending the slope of Queensborough Bridge, running through the slanted, flashing shadows of suspended cables. The children stood up to see the slate grey water below, but in just a few moments they were off the bridge and rolling down a wide tree-lined boulevard. The children began to shriek, and Lucia Santa told them, yes, now they were on Long Island. In 1965, Puzo's novel, beg your pardon. In 1926, Puzo's novel, 65, Puzo's novel showed the world that either no longer existed or was rapidly disappearing. A city landscape inhabited by first-generation immigrants described from the suburbs by a second-generation writer who succeeded to escape. A writer who neatly perceives the 1960s crisis of the American society and projects it backward in time to unveil its inner causes. The Fortunate Pilgrim, that was the first important novel published by an Italian-American writer after Di Donato's Christ in Concrete, is not an immigrant novel. It wasn't written from within the world it describes. Though Puzo, who was only 9 years younger than Di Donato, formerly belonged to the second generation, his own location in time, space, and culture is beyond the limits of the Great Migration. That to say, the migration that took place from roughly 1880 to mid-1920s. His book might be called a post-immigrant novel, a sample of a new self-conception of ethnic identity, a fresh start for the Italian-American literary and cultural tradition, whose outcome would be evident a few years later with the publication of The Godfather. As a new starter, The Fortunate Pilgrim cannot avoid confronting its own predecessors. Particularly, it establishes a dialogue with the classical Di Donato's novel, Christ in Concrete, reconsidering the myths of personal sacrifice that novel unwillingly contributed to spreading, casting a pitiless and unsentimental glance on the world of the Great Migration. In Puzo, there is a distance and a bitterness that cannot be traced in Di Donato's tragic and solemn pages. Among the many examples that I will not give here, it will suffice to compare one evident intertextual link between the two novels. The climatic description of Jeremiah's horrible death, drawn in concrete, the enshrining of the builder, with the anticlimactic and almost parodic death of Lucia Santa's first husband. His death was comically grotesque. While a ship was being unloaded, the gangplank had given way high above the water, plunging 5 men in untold tons of bananas down into the river mud. Human limbs and banana stalks buried together, never rising once. Abandoning the old landscape implies the demythification of its builders, a reconsideration of one's own identity through criticizing the first immigrant generation and the establishing of emotional links with a new environment. And that's all.
Thank you very much, but before we go, I know that there are some questions, at least I know there are some from the students in my class, but also anybody who wants to ask anything.
Have you found any literature that describes the changes in the Italians in Italy after that Great Migration? So after all the 5 million people left the country, how it changed the family that stayed home?
Well, for example, in a very famous and important book called Mount Allegro by German Gione, that was published in 1943, the last couple of chapters show the protagonist going back to Italy. And so he visited the real Italy that he only knew through the stories that his parents had told him. And it's interesting because he discovered that there was a big difference between that mythological Sicily he knew and real Sicily at the end of the 30s, that to say, during the fascist regime. And he discovered one important thing, that even his own parents were not entirely Sicilians. That to say, they had absorbed, they had changed themselves because now they were acquainted with the American ways. So, for example, in that case, there was a comparison between the old ways there back in Italy and the reality of Italian Americans. That's a typical sample, I think. Don't know if there's more than this, of course, but this is the classical example I could give you.
In your article that you present, you describe the transition from Italians to America, and then further on, kind of this post-immigrant sense with Italian-American children that grow up in the cities of America. Where do you see from this point the future of Italo-American literature in this country, if there is a future for it?
Okay, first of all, I have to say that I'm trying to describe phenomena not from within. That to say, I'm not an Italian American, of course. I'm an Italian emigrated somehow. But your question really entails a very long answer, but I'll just give you some ideas. First of all, to my point of view, we have to understand whether an Italian-American literature exists. So this is the first problem. I mean, of course, what we have to do is mapping the intertextual links of different texts, novels and autobiographies that began appearing, let's say, at the end of the 20s, and they still exist now. I mean, there is someone writing, considering himself as an Italian-American writer. Okay, but I'm more concerned about, let's say, the internal story of, for example, why certain genres, literary genres, are used and not others. I mean, if an Italian-American tradition exists, it should be described according to literary tools. Okay, so what's the future of something that I can't describe right now? It's a bit difficult to answer this question, you know. Ask the Italian Americans here. That's to say, ask the Italian American writers what they consider themselves. If, it's a matter that if I compare, and anyway, there is another problem. If I compare Italian immigrants and their descendants in Germany or Argentina or in Australia, I discovered that the development of their writing is very different from what happened here in the United States. I think that only in the United States there is a debate around the identity of the Italian something, American in this case, writer. Okay, so it should be interesting to start a general study on the comparison of the different experience that appeared in the Italian immigration all over the world, and within this framework, we should study the Italian American case. So I can tell you, you know, it depends a bit on how you view the problem on the third or fourth or fifth generation. It's always been described as a sort of cycle. So there is an up and down. The second generation hates, let's say, the fathers. But then the third generation, when the fathers become grandfathers, they try to rediscover their roots, for example. So if those writers start writing on their own identity, okay, we could call that a sort of Italian-American narrative. What will happen to this? I can't forecast. Okay.
Are there writers today who are writing in the 2010, writing anything that you would consider Italian American?
They are very interesting. Well, I suppose that if you go to a bookshop here in Philadelphia, wherever, you can find a lot of Italian surnames on the front page of many novels. Some of them, they deal with an Italian American subject. That to say, for example, a book I love is from a third or fourth, I think, Italian American writer. Her name is Rita Ciresi. That's the Italian pronunciation. Suppose she calls himself Ciresi or something like that. Ciresi. A book called Sometimes I Dream in Italian, which is a very touching novel. Well, it's a collection of short stories, really, but with the same protagonist. This is very common in second generation writing, not only in Italian American writings, even in other traditions. That to say, second generations, they start often writing short stories in a sort of novel format, where the protagonist is always the same. It's about children and their growth. It's more or less the Mark Twain model, if you understand this, okay? So there's a big production. Even this great writer, the Greek-American Sedaris, okay? Do you know him, Sedaris? Have you heard about him?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, first book, it's this kind of book it is called Me Talk Pretty One Day.
Yeah.
It's a nice book. It's the children of the Greek-American family struggling with their own identity. The same thing that you can find in Mount Allegro in 1943, or you can find in My Name is Aaron by Soroyan, 1937, an Armenian writer. So, of course, there are many. It's unbelievable. You can find tens and tens of writers publishing novels and short stories and presenting themselves and the books as Italian Americans. So
It's interesting to see what you produce, the Italian Americans, because you are the ones who are integrated. Will you produce something that can be considered Italian American, or is just American, or is just the last name that is Italian? And so, what is it that we see? And not just in literature, but in general, because I was very struck by the idea that Italian Americans had this idea, I wrote it, of creating work that belongs to posterity. Do you think that Italian Americans still have this idea of themselves as creating work that belongs to posterity, that will last, that will...
again, I should ask them.
We should ask them.
My opinion is there are a lot of themes that can be traced there in the novels. For example, a very interesting theme is the lack of the language, the drama of not knowing Italian. There are a lot of, I can tell you 2 or 3 examples. There is a short story by John Fante. He describes his child when he was 12 or 13, something like that, back in Colorado. So his father didn't want to go to Mass on Sunday. And there was a second or third generation Italian American priest there who sent messages through the children to the father saying, why doesn't he go to Mass? So the priest tried to convince Fante's father to go to Mass and to confess. One day the priest goes to the house and talks to the father. Talks to the father and said, oh, I want you to confess. This is very important. When did you confess yourself last time? Oh, it was a long time ago. So why don't you do it now? And the father said, okay, I'll do that by writing. I'll write down all my sins. So the priest says, okay, it's a deal. Okay, I'll do that. So the day after, in the morning, Fante's father wakes up and starts writing all his sins during the whole day, a stack of paper. And so at the end of the day, he gives the stack of paper to the child and says, go and give the priest all my confession. And the day after, the priest comes again to the house, angry, say, you are pulling my leg, this is terrible, what you have done. So the father says, I did what that was the deal. I wrote down everything. I didn't forget anything at all, every single sin. Yeah, but you wrote it in Italian. That was. So it's very interesting because the priest couldn't understand Fante's father's sins. But even the protagonist, Fante, couldn't understand his father. Or there is a very nice story in this book by Rita Ciresi. She remembers, for example, there is the protagonist, who is a fourth generation Italian-American, always heard his mother saying, I remember all those people in the old days, Italian-Americans across the street saying, che si dice when they met, che si dice. So I don't understand the blacks, they always say, hey man, what's happening, this is a stupid thing. Why do they say always, what's happening? So one day, the protagonist asks her mother, but wait a minute, I think that what's happening and che si dice more or less should be the same. What does che si dice mean? And her mother said, I don't know. I don't know. I mean, the drama of the lack of the language, something that disappeared through generations. This can be described in literary terms through the analysis of many novels. And this, for example, would be another nice research to do. And there are many for them, or some of these themes are slightly different in, let's say, the Italian-German tradition, if something like that exists, or do not exist at all in Argentina, for example. No, it depends. Many questions, more questions?
The Italians in Argentina were accepted than the Italians in Germany or the Italians here. We were talking about, the literature that they had. Is there more acceptance in the general society?
First of all, you have to consider that half of the population of Argentina is of Italian descent. I mean, this is the first problem. Then, I couldn't find any clue of the building of a hybrid tradition, a hybrid identity between the Argentinian side or the Spanish line and the Italian line. So this is a completely different problem. I don't think that any writer in Argentina considers himself as an Italian-Argentinian. They are Argentinian, period. That's all.
In Germany?
No, there's more. No, there's more conscience there because in Germany they keep writing in both languages, in Italian and in German. There are 3 or 4 very nice cases. One is this man Carmine Abate, which is, I mean, it's pretty popular right now. He wrote 3 or 4 novels in German and maybe 10 in Italian. So they are bilingual. But this.
Do they feel outside slightly?
No, they consider themselves half and half, because they still use the 2 languages. You know, Germany, it's a 6-hour trip from southern Germany to northern Italy. They still have a lot of links of contacts. So it's a completely different situation. And even the immigration, beg your pardon, the immigration to Germany is more recent than the American case, because they started after World War II. So it's in the last 50, 60 years.
How do they relate to the past? Is it an immediate past, or do they relate to ancient Italy?
You mean the idea of the... they try to, generally, well, sometimes, one of the weapons the first immigrants had to try to establish their own identity and to strive for their lives in a hostile environment, one of the things they did, that they tried to evoke the glorious past of Italy, from Julius Caesar to Columbus to whatever. But this is not, this doesn't happen everywhere, or depends a bit on, so don't know if you...
Do you know how Italians living in Italy today feel about Italian Americans? Like, do they see it as like a negative thing?
That's a good question. That's a good question. in the last 20 years, for a lot of reasons, there is a sort of rediscovery of the problem of immigration. When I was young, when I was 15, no one talked about immigration. I have kinfolks of mine, relatives of mine from the south. I'm from Rome, but my maternal grandma was from the south, from Calabria. So I have a lot of people there, relatives there in Argentina or in Canada or in Brazil, but no one talked about them. There was a bit sort of, you know, it looked like they were despised, you know, because they were illiterate when they left, because they came from poor rural areas, and 20 years ago no one talked about them. We didn't want to do, I remember that the only case when immigrants were remembered in some way was when the Italian football team played abroad, and everyone said they were playing in Germany or in Argentina. We hope they win for our immigrants there. It was the only case. But in the last 20 years, this is very good. There is a new interest towards what had been happening in the last 150 years. And this is because, for example, there are celebrations. Next year it will be 150 years from the unity of Italy. That's to say, it's an occasion to think about ourselves, to try to define the Italian identity, especially in a moment in which there are some forces in the north, Lega Nord, I don't know if you know this, that are trying to write a new history of Italy according to strategies that I don't like myself. So right now there's a new interest, and a lot of things have been published in the last 10 or 15 years. A lot of things. It's very remarkable.
Professor Giuliani, vorrei fare una domanda.
Benissimo. Ok.
You just said your parents come from Calabria.
Sì.
Exactly from where?
For me? You are a Calabrese.
Yes.
From the very first word, I understood that by the accent. Great. From provincia di Catanzaro.
Catanzaro, io vengo da Catanzaro. Sapete da dove?
Da dove? Da Soverato.
Io vengo da Castellino.
No, non Soverato, Satriano, un poco dentro.
Are you brothers?
No, sì, ma come si chiama Gasperino? Gasperino Satriano.
Satriano.
Satriano sono sì, forse 7 kilometers, about 7 miles away from my hometown.
Wow.
And I've been to Satriano many times.
Wow, that's great. The last time I was there, I was 16, so and I didn't meet him. I mean, I looked around, but he wasn't there. So when did you immigrate?
I came here in 1977. I was 13 and a half years old when I came over.
77. So I was 14, so I couldn't meet you. Okay. Anyway, no, there's plenty of us everywhere.
I was a teenager and I grew up in the United States, all by myself.
Okay. You know someone there in Satriano? Some of the surnames? Chiaravallotti?
Chiaravallotti, sì.
Chiaravallotti. Procopio, yeah.
Di Filippo.
Di Filippo, no. My grandmother was Chiaravallotti.
Chiaravallotti, ok. C'è l'ingegnere Chiaravallotti di Gasperina. The engineer.
Yeah, there must be relatives or something. Because it's a very... I have to tell you, this is... It sounds to me just like the old story. I don't know if this is politically correct, but anyway.
They won't fire you. They won't fire you.
Right, you can see it.
So there is this man, a carpenter dying, and he goes to heaven, and there is St. Peter there. And this man can't remember anything at all. So he can't remember his own name, what he was doing. I remember more or less was a carpenter. Okay, says St. Peter, I'll call the boss. So Jesus comes and talks to this man, saying, can you remember something? Yeah, I remember I was a carpenter. And so Jesus says, did you have children? I had only one son. So Jesus, so Jesus says, Father. And the other one says, Pinocchio. Okay. Sorry for that. No, but I remember a nice story. Do we have time?
I do. Do you have time?
Okay.
It's those who need to leave for other things are allowed to leave freely.
Okay, more questions. That's more important. Do you have any further questions? Nothing at all. Okay.
And then we have time for the story.
No, just the story is this: that my grandmother, before dying, in the mid '80s or the beginning of the '90s, she went to visit for the first time in 40 years her sister, and she went to Argentina. They spent an unbelievable week together because, you know, someone coming from the old country, and they had huge meals in restaurants with mandolinos, orchestras, and Italian flags and all this stuff. That's a nice story. So she went back to Rome, and a couple of years after that, again they called from Argentina saying that one day some of the members of the Argentinian line of the family went to Brazil, to Sao Paulo, and they found out that there was a shop of, don't know if a restaurant or whatever, with the surname Chiaravallotti on it. And this is it is not a very common surname. There are some.
I would say yes, because Latin Americans from the south part of Italy went to Argentina. Even my uncle went to Argentina, as my father told me. This was back in 1940, maybe 41, 42. That's the first time he went to Argentina.
Yeah, but anyway, I mean, back in Calabria, Chiaravallotti is not the most spread surname around.
No.
So this is what was very strange. They got in the shop and asked, and they discovered that they were the descendants of one Pietro Chiaravallotti who had emigrated, was the brother of my my grandmother. So my grandmother had a grandfather, and that grandfather had a brother. That brother emigrated in 1862 to Brazil, and no one knew anything about him. So for the first time after 150 years or something like that, 40 years, the two lines, the Brazilian and the Argentinian, got in touch through this fact, you know, that they had contacted my grandmother, and so we can trace down all the tree of the family. So this is a nice story.
I had the opportunity to meet the ex-mayor of Philadelphia, Frank Rizzo, okay, personally. And he told me that his grandparents come from Chiaravalle.
Chiaravalle, that's
right near you.
yeah.
Now,
Well,
I don't
me.
know if Frank Rizzo, his grandparents came from Calabria.
Okay. Yeah, no, yeah, no. I mean, it's a common thing. You can find.
And here, it's not. Yeah, here.
All of Calabria is here.
No, but the Sicilians in here too.
Yeah, in Calabria too. So yeah.
I have a question.
Okay.
What is it you don't like about the Lega del Nord in Italy?
What I don't like about. Do we have? How many hours do we have? Do we have spare time? A couple of hours at least. Okay. Because they are.
Don't know where to start.
I don't know where.
In
It's
different countries, there is
Huh?
big openings.
no, of course, but they are all the labels that you can imagine, labels such as racist, xenophobe, or very extreme right wing, separatists. Okay, all those labels work with the Lega Nord. I mean, it's a sort of disease we have right now in Italy, and we hope that in the next.
Innovators, they try to improve Italy.
Are you sure? Well, okay. Don't know.
No, it's not sure.
Okay.
He's putting a leg.
No, it's
I
another.
know him. He's not sure.
Okay.
But I think we should close here. I think that I particularly dislike one thing of the Lega Nord, which is that they deny that Italians were immigrants too. So the denial of our own origins, which I hope was important for you tonight, whether you're Italian in your origins or whether you're from Puerto Rico and therefore Spanish, because all other origins, the goal is, I hope, for you to acquire a passion to discover more about your roots. And I wanted to thank you, Professor Giuliani, for this wonderful enlightening talk.